Nou, erg bedankt voor het uitnodiging om vandaag hier te zijn om een toespraak te geven op een heel belangrijke, ingewikkelde onderwerp, Europa. Het is zeker ook in zo'n schitterende kerk, zo'n mooie zaal. En voor mij ook altijd om in Nederland te zijn. Het land van mijn moeder is een bijzonder plezier. Ik heb zelf familie hier, daar middenin, nichtjes, neefjes. Maar helaas, mijn Nederlands is eigenlijk een soort familiekeukentaal. Dus het is niet goed genoeg om een hele toespraak, een hele speech over zo'n belangrijk onderwerp te geven in Nederlands. Dus ik ga door in Engels. En uw Engels is perfect, dat weet ik. Maar misschien daarna, als u vragen stelt in Nederlands, probeer ik wel met een soort van gemengsel van Engels en Nederlands een antwoord te geven. My speech today, my remarks today, really just try and address why the European Union is in a state of crisis, which I believe it to be, and what we can do about it. I think it's no exaggeration to say that the European Union is probably in a more perilous condition, certainly as far as public support is concerned, as was alluded to earlier, than at almost any time since its establishment over half a century ago. For the first time in living memory, it is possible to imagine that the European Union might, at its very worst, unravel or certainly descend into a state of prolonged semi-permanent disunity. Even in core founding member states like the Netherlands, public and political opinion has never been as threadbare as it is now. Euroscepticism, in other words, is no longer just a British issue or a British phenomenon. According to the Eurobarometer survey, between 2007 and 2012, net support for the European Union, the difference between those who tend to trust the European Union and those who don't, fell astonishingly from plus 10% to minus 22% in France, from plus 20% to minus 29% in Germany, from plus 30% to minus 22% in Italy, and from minus 13%, it always was minus, to minus 49% in the United Kingdom. Here in the Netherlands, net support for the European Union during that period of time, just 5 years, from 2007 to 2012, fell from plus 44% in 2007 to minus 8% in 2012. Now, you might not wish to trust opinion polls. I certainly learnt not to. Sometimes I wish I trusted them a bit more. I might have known what was coming. But even if those figures may be approximations, they nonetheless, I think, should prompt us to ask us why. Why has this happened? Why has there been this precipitate and sudden collapse in public confidence and trust in the European Union? I believe that there are a mixture of long-term and short-term and general and specific reasons for that. One of them clearly is the continuing aftershocks of that terrible economic earthquake that we witnessed across Europe, across the developed world in 2008. I think it is impossible to exaggerate what a debilitating effect it has had on people's faith in governments at all levels when millions and millions of our fellow citizens have sustained such an unprecedented long period of decline in their living standards and their disposable incomes. The effect on people's family budgets, on people's abilities to provide for their children, to plan for the future with confidence, has been under greater pressure for a longer period of time than any time since the oil shocks in the early 1970s, arguably worse than any time in the post-war period. And people feel enraged, understandably, and unprotected from the mistakes made by a distant elite in the financial and banking sector, and they feel that governments of all descriptions have failed to protect them from the after effects which they themselves feel. And that, I think, probably of all the explanations remains one of the most powerful ones for the era of populism, of political volatility, of distrust in politics that we are experiencing across the European Union. But there are other reasons. The tensions within the Eurozone currency union between the creditor countries, Germany, the Netherlands and others, particularly in the north of Europe, and the so-called peripheral debtor countries places a huge strain. It's creating a chasm at the very heart of the European Union. Of course, when the Eurozone was first launched, the imbalance between the creditor and debtor countries within that currency union was papered over. It was disguised as banks just threw money irresponsibly at people, and over-indebted consumers in Spain and Portugal happily bought Philips washing machines and Volkswagens manufactured in Germany. Everyone was happy. And that disguise, that camouflage also covered up that terrible error made by the then Chancellor of Germany, Gerhard Schröder, and the then President of France, Jacques Chirac, when in 2005 they basically decreed that the fiscal rules of the Eurozone would not apply to France and Germany. If it doesn't apply to France and Germany, what kind of message does that send out to the rest of the Eurozone? But the effects of that north-south divide might have been, as I say, submerged by the period of irresponsible and easy credit that was provided to millions of consumers at the outset. But of course, when the crisis hit in 2008, that huge imbalance came to the surface and is still there for all to see, with the devastating social consequences, particularly of mass unemployment in a huge swathe of southern Europe. I think the generational shift away from that generation of voters and politicians and leaders who felt in their heart, in their solar plexus, that visceral emotional commitment to European integration as a triumph of peace over war. I think that generation is giving way to a post-war generation that doesn't feel, and again, this was quite rightly alluded to earlier, don't feel that visceral emotional attachment for the founding reasons of European integration, as that episode in European history increasingly fades into history and into the history books. And that leads, I think, to a loss of both unity and emotional commitment to European cooperation. The risk that one of the European Union's largest member states, the United Kingdom, might choose to, I fervently hope it will not, we will not, but the risk that the United Kingdom might choose to leave the European Union, and that is now coming to a head in the forthcoming referendum, only adds to a palpable feeling of a lack of leadership amongst the larger countries in the European Union. The United Kingdom basically talking to itself, exercising almost no meaningful leadership on the big issues of the day within Europe. The Franco-German duo is simply not what it once was. When I first worked as a junior official in the European Commission in the mid-1990s, those are the days where people would say, France decides, Germany writes the checks, and everybody else basically obeys. That's all changed now. It's changed utterly. And now we have a dominant nation, Germany, understandably, for historical reasons, reluctant to exercise the leadership which in a sense is naturally incumbent upon it. So we have this vacuum of leadership from particularly the larger member states, exacerbated, as I said, by this prospect that one of them may soon quit altogether. The migration crisis and the patent inability of the current European Union to cope with these huge numbers of desperate people fleeing violence and catastrophe in their own nations has done huge, and is continuing to do huge damage to public confidence. I've always felt myself that you can have in the European Union, or at least in the Schengen area, you can either have no internal borders and very strong external borders, Or you can have very strong internal borders and no external borders. What you can't have is none of either, which is now what we've got, and which is why Schengen and the very principle of freedom of movement is now under unprecedented pressure. And then finally, and of course most tragically, the acute sense of vulnerability that millions of our fellow citizens feel in the wake of terrorist attacks, particularly in the wake of that gruesome, bloody and barbaric attack in Paris last year, also does grievous damage to people's confidence that things are being run as they should. And the European Union, so far at least, simply doesn't seem to be the answer to that very primeval, legitimate hope that people have that those in charge will keep their streets safe and keep their families safe in their homes. Now, in the past, when the European Community or the European Union has encountered crises, it has almost always those crises have almost always served as catalysts, as spurs for ingenuity and for new forms of integration and for new solutions to those crises to be found. Each crisis, in a sense, looking back, has led to several different unions developing in an overlapping manner. The very creation of the European Community was, of course, a union of reconciliation, a union which sought to reconcile exclusively, principally but not exclusively, France and Germany, cementing peace in a continent which had been so drenched in blood and conflict for so long. The creation later of the single market and then the single currency was an attempt to create an economic union of prosperity after the deep recessions in the 1970s and the 1980s. Entry for Spain, for Portugal and Greece helped create a union for democracy, responding to the crisis of military fascism and dictatorship in those southern European countries. Extending membership to a string of countries in Central and Eastern Europe was creating yet another union, a union of stability, providing stability to a whole string of countries that had suffered so terribly under the yoke of Soviet communism. And in my view, in response to this latest crisis, the European Union, in order to recover its sense of unity, its sense of relevance and purpose, I think a number of things must happen. First, of course, we must resolve the British issue, making the positive case, not only for membership of the United Kingdom in the European Union, but then also for leadership of the United Kingdom in the European Union, where that leadership is appropriate and welcome. We will need to accept that a move to, in effect, a sort of hub and spoke model of membership in the European Union is already a lived reality and is something to be welcomed rather than shunned, with member states having slightly altered and slightly different forms of membership within one single European Union club to suit their cultural and political situation. The notion, in any event, of a perfectly uniform straitjacket of membership for a club as diverse as one made up of 28 member states was never feasible. But we must now embrace the supple ingenuity and flexibility which does allow somewhat altered terms of membership. Some countries are members of the Eurozone, others are not. Some members are members of Schengen, others are not. Some members, such as the United Kingdom, participate in justice and police cooperation, but don't in various provisions of it, and so on and so forth, whilst still, of course, adhering to some of the core basic rules and principles. We need, and I suspect this is going to be a spectacularly unwelcome thing to say to a Dutch audience, but my view is we need an honest debate about the need for fiscal transfers from richer to poorer member states, solidarity as well as discipline within the Eurozone. I know that's not popular here, but just as much as debtor countries in Southern Europe need to understand that their membership depends on sticking to the rules, on budgetary and fiscal discipline and self-discipline, it is my view that creditor countries must also accept that no diverse currency union is sustainable without accompanying shock absorbers, which in one way or another have to be paid for by the wealthier member states. And we will need, throughout all of this, to put a good old-fashioned Dutch principle into place, which Prime Minister Rutte has spoken about so articulately: Europe where necessary, national where possible. But where I want to focus my remaining remarks on is on the most pressing task of all. I believe that the European Union must now create, in effect, a new union of security and liberty to provide its citizens with a sense of safety and protection at a time of unprecedented fear. If the European Union fails to provide that reassurance, populists will win the day. We've seen what Marine Le Pen in France, what Nigel Farage in the United Kingdom, and populists elsewhere have been saying this week in the wake of those Paris attacks, already seeking to use those terrible attacks to pursue their wider ambition of turning countries inwards and away from each other. And in my view, the creation of a new union of security and liberty has three main elements. First, properly policed and controlled external borders. The arrangements at the moment are simply too weak. Frontex, which is the external border agency of the European Union, has a budget, a measly budget of 143 million euros, and is wildly overstretched. It is little more than a rather weak coordination agency. It has no staff or equipment of its own, and it's hugely hampered by a lack of cooperation and support from member states who provide all the resources on the ground. Frontex's own leaders believe that a fully functional border agency can only exist if given executive powers to demand or own equipment. Now, that is understandably highly controversial. It would mean, in effect, member states with external borders accepting border guards which may be line managed by an EU agency. And I don't believe that is ever going to happen. But we do need to start having the debate about how we can act, and act fast, to have properly policed borders if we want to safeguard that cherished principle of freedom of movement within the borderless Schengen area. And this also points, in my view, to the need for common immigration and asylum policies. At the moment, there is a lot of uncertainty about what to do with people once they've been picked up at the EU's external border. Frontex was designed to combat small flows of illegal immigration. It was not designed to cope with mass migration from war zones. Secondly, we need, accompanying the properly policed and administered external borders, we need a step change in internal security cooperation as well. There is already pretty sophisticated cooperation against organised cross-border crime within the European Union through Europol here in Den Haag, and police and judicial authorities have been cooperating, sharing databases and working to common standards for many years. In fact, it's been a source of great frustration to me that the United Kingdom does not participate in those measures more fully. Yet cooperation on counter-terrorism lags way, way behind. The reports which we've read in the newspapers this week, they're as yet unconfirmed, and they may not prove to be true, that one of the Paris terrorists entered Greece from Syria in the summer raises questions about counter-terrorist cooperation within the European Union that has been neglected for far, far too long. Of course, the European Union does not need, and it would never be able, to impose some kind of harmonised arrangement on different security and intelligence agencies across the European Union. But the question is whether we can do more to coordinate cross-border operations and share intelligence. And there's also a long way to go on cybercrime, which is among the biggest borderless challenges we face of all. The relatively new European Cybercrime Centre, again, based here in The Hague, is an excellent start, but we need to do a whole lot more. But third, perhaps the hardest and biggest task of all is a huge geostrategic challenge, and it is this. What can we do to provide stability across the Mediterranean basin. The Mediterranean, in my view, is now a region in acute distress. Large stretches of North Africa, most especially in Libya, are in turmoil. Southern Europe is still facing acute economic difficulties. The Middle East is engulfed by violence. In the longer term, the demographic pressures on Europe's southern borders are only going to grow. By 2050, Europe's population is projected to fall from 730 million to 700 million, while Africa's is expected to double to 2.4 billion. A few weeks ago, NATO's Deputy Secretary General was quoted as saying that the Mediterranean is now considered to be, I quote, contested space. Now that comment, that somewhat chilling comment, it encapsulates how dramatically the stakes have changed in the Mediterranean region as Russia moves to challenge American and NATO hegemony and to defend its strategic interests. The response by the European Union and the wider world to the collapse of the Berlin Wall back in 1989 gives, in my view, a clue to all of us about what we should now do in the Mediterranean. At that time, hundreds of billions of pounds of economic support were poured into Central and Eastern Europe. New institutions, like the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, based in London, were created. The prospect of membership was offered, EU membership was offered to countries in Central and Eastern Europe. And it was a devastatingly successful collective effort to provide economic and social and political stability to a whole part of our hemisphere which had been left traumatized by Soviet communist rule. Europe desperately needs to rediscover the same level of ambition that we showed in 1989 towards Central and Eastern Europe, towards the Mediterranean today. If the European Union can preside over post-war reconciliation between France and Germany, can extend its membership across the whole continent, can create the world's largest borderless single market, create a new currency, surely it can also lead an international effort to bring hope and stability to the Mediterranean. This, in my view, should be the single most important project for every single one of the leaders of European Union governments. It is an effort which will require years, if not decades, of application. And yet, the European Union has a history of failed initiatives in this area and responded in a hopelessly piecemeal fashion to the Arab Spring 5 years ago. In 1995, the European Union established the Barcelona process to foster integration across the Mediterranean. It was widely criticized, rightly, for failing to achieve its goals and was then replaced in 2008 by the 43-nation Union for the Mediterranean, which in turn is all but defunct today. Following the Arab Spring, further attempts were made under the auspices of the European Union's neighbourhood policy, with the then British Commissioner and EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs, Cathy Ashton, announcing a partnership for democracy and shared prosperity for the southern Mediterranean. Again, however, the words were never translated into deeds. After the Second World War, the Marshall Plan saw the United States give the equivalent in today's prices of $130 billion to help rebuild the economies of Western Europe. I believe we now need something similar, if not bigger, for the Mediterranean today. The Mediterranean may be the crucible of so much European culture and civilization, but it is now also the source of many of the ideological, economic, and social problems our continent faces and will continue to face for many years to come. This effort will require a huge amount of finance at a time when governments are short of money. Yet history and experience suggests that at the end this is a matter of political will, not accountancy, as the US response after World War II and the EU support following the collapse of the Berlin Wall show. If the threat that the Mediterranean now poses is sufficiently well understood, and I believe it is not, then the money can and will be mobilized. So, in conclusion, the European Union is indeed at a very perilous point in its history. We are, in that overused cliche, at a fork in the road. The climate of fear in which we live will either drive us apart, drive us towards ever more extreme, beggar thy neighbour, chauvinistic politics across the European continent, or it will, as occurred in the past, push governments to raise their sights, raise their ambitions, and work together for the security of the continent as a whole. The choice is theirs, but for the sake of future generations, let us hope they make the right choice. Thank you very much for listening to me. Blijf ik hier?
Thank you very much for this introduction. I'm sure that your analysis, both of the causes of the crisis of the European Union, as well as the general solutions and the specific solutions to the current security crisis, has been food for thought for the audience. Mr. Clegg would very much like to engage in Q&A and also debate with you. If you want to ask a question or comment on his speech, please feel free to raise your hand. Someone will come to you with a microphone, and if you would be so kind to introduce yourself, you can discuss with Mr. Clegg. Who may I give the floor first?
If you don't ask a question, I will take that as universal agreement, which would be very unwelcome to some. So,
there on the left. Yeah, it's coming. It's coming.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Clegg, for your interesting words. I wanted to ask you to elaborate a bit more. You said we need to raise funds to help the Mediterranean region. It's going to be very hard to find people who want to give all that money, countries who want to give all the money, but maybe the bigger problem is who are we going to give this money to? Because you also need a recipient. And yet in this region, everybody fights over everything. And how do we stop this money that we might be able to raise to help that region to be another casus belli, because then they're going to fight over yet another thing, which is the funds that we might make available. How do we stop that?
Well, look, and the first thing is, one of the first jobs I ever did in Brussels, well, actually job was a rather ambitious noun for what I did. I made the coffee and did a bit of photocopying as an intern I can't remember when it was now, the early 90s. Was in something called, it was located in the European Commission, I remember well, it was called the G24 Coordination Unit. And I worked alongside, or at least I made coffee and tea for officials, not from European Union member states, but from Japan, from Canada, from the United States, from New Zealand, from Australia, as well as from the European Union countries. And what basically happened then was that in the wake of the collapse of the Berlin Wall, Jacques Delors very quickly offered the European Commission as a funnel, as a sort of forum for huge donations and investments, not just from European Union member states, from around the world, because there was not just a European, but a global consensus that it was in everybody's interests to provide support and provide political stability to Central and Eastern Europe. And it is my view that if you look at what's happening in the Mediterranean now, there is a global interest in making sure that the Mediterranean does not subside into what I predict will happen if we don't take ambitious action, which is further forms of extremism, conflict, violence, and mass migration and ideological hatred in parts of the Mediterranean at least. And so part of it, yes, is about mobilizing money not just from ourselves but from other countries. It's partly perhaps about the creation of new institutions. The EBRD, I think, has been a pretty good model of the way in which you can make sure that money is well spent on projects which do make sense. But I would say this, I actually don't think it's just about money. It's also about overcoming our own protectionism. One of the reasons why these initiatives that I alluded to in the past, the Barcelona process, the this, the that, the other, all these different acronyms, why they didn't work was because they kept bumping up against particularly industrial agricultural protectionism in Europe. And it is just not sustainable for a relatively prosperous continent such as ours to close our markets from the imports of wretched, poor countries on our southern flank. It is economically, in my view, irrational. It's morally, in my view, reprehensible as well. So it's not just about us signing checks. It's also about us being much tougher on ourselves about opening our markets to our near neighbours in the Mediterranean, and also considering much more imaginative ways of providing an incentive to civil and political reform in those countries as well. Now, clearly, the great catalyst for reform in Central and Eastern Europe was the prospect of membership, full membership of the European Union. And I'm not proposing now that the whole of North Africa becomes the membership of the European Union. But the EU has become very adept over the years in creating intermediate forms of associate membership or semi-associate membership, which can act as a very powerful catalyst for political elites and governments to thwart corruption, to deliver the rule of law, to provide great prosperity to their citizens. Look, I don't have all the answers. Of course I don't. I just have a very, very strong instinct that we are going to bemoan terribly our failure in this generation to respond more strategically and more ambitiously to what's going on in the Mediterranean, and we will bemoan that and rue the day that we didn't take greater action in 5, 10, 15 years' time if we don't start acting now.
Thank you. Now, yes, please. If you could introduce yourself as a speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Clegg. My name is Milan Bijl. Last year I studied at the LSE during the general elections. I currently work at the Ministry of Economic Affairs. It is my sense that in the EU we see all this frustration in different countries. It's because people feel underrepresented or not properly represented in the EU. Now, having witnessed the majoritarian system, I think you could agree that under a proportional representation or more direct democracy, you would have had 51 seats in the House of Commons instead of the 8. How do you think we should have...
I'm going to start weeping. Just stop reminding me.
Yeah, sorry. I just had to put it in there. I
have to bring that up.
How do you think we should address this issue of not feeling properly represented in the EU?
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, you know, the academics and all the rest of it call it, you know, famously the democratic deficit. In other words, the decisions are taken which affect our daily lives, from the quality of our drinking water to the phytosanitary standards of imported chicken legs. I mean, you know, so much of the very fabric of our daily life is governed by decisions which aren't taken by our local or regional national governments, but taken by the European Union, and yet they're taken often in impenetrably sort of technocratic manner, sort of beyond our sort of political reach, if you like. Now, part of the problem is that I think some of that is possibly inevitable. When you take decisions, you know, covering such a vast area, 500 million consumers, the lines of accountability become very thinly stretched. Of course they do. I remember I was a member of the European Parliament for 5 years. And one of the reasons I only did one term was I became incredibly frustrated that I'd been elected for a region in the United Kingdom which had, I think it was 4/5, it was called the East Midlands. It covers Nottinghamshire, Leicestershire, Derbyshire, Northamptonshire and so on. I think it's about the same as about 4/5 of the whole population of Denmark. There was no way that I could have a meaningful relationship of political accountability when I was representing a region, you know, the size of a small, you know, of a small European country. It just didn't work. I either spent all my time flying between Nottingham, Brussels or Strasbourg, or I spent all my time furiously driving up and down the M1, trying to make my presence felt. I've got no neat answer to that, unless you create a European Parliament of, you know, 3,000 members or something and create small, but you know, you wouldn't. So I think part of it is inevitable, but part of it is self-inflicted too. And this is where I believe actually, if you're honest about this, the fundamental problem is not Brussels per se. Brussels is a very convenient whipping boy. Of course, it's Brussels is not perfect. Of course it's not. No government, no decision-making institution I know. I mean, having spent 5 years in Whitehall and Westminster, I can assure you that is no perfect arrangement either. The European Union, when I worked in the European Commission, I remember there was a time when it took 15 years for the European Union to decide the definition of chocolate in a chocolate directive, because there was a huge debate between Britain that wanted vegetable fat chocolate to be recognised. It's a bit diversion, you'll see why I'm telling you this chocolate story. And purists who said that cocoa is the only proper ingredient of chocolate. Anything that takes a decade and a half to decide what chocolate is not a particularly efficient arrangement. But also, it's clearly not a particularly menacing superstate either. I mean, a menacing superstate would not take 15 years to decide how you define chocolate. The problem is not so much the imperfections of Brussels, it's that, quite again, understandably, the European Union is in effect a confederal rather than federal arrangement. It's a forum, in effect, for 28 countries to thrash out compromises with each other, basically. Yes, you've got these sort of quasi-federal institutions like the European Commission and the European Parliament, but the beating heart of European decision-making is an endless, non-stop, 24-hour, 365-day-a-year haggle, horse trading. And that is pretty unedifying, it's often very boring, and it's very impenetrable. And it means that the national political and administrative elites spend all that time talking to each other and often not actually admitting to the fact that they're striking endless bargains with other countries. Because, you know, then they go back, you know, a British minister returns from the Council of Ministers in Brussels having made some painful concession, lands in Heathrow and says, oh, look what these dreadful Europeans have made me do, even though she or he might have actually happily conceded to it. Or what you often get, I've seen this a lot in domestic politics, national politicians will want to claim that they are more sort of sovereign or more in control of decisions which are actually subject to supranational compromise than they're prepared to admit. So I think part of it is inevitable, but part of it is a slight lack of honesty and a lack of candour and lack of transparency from national governments about how they conduct their business in the European Union. So my personal view is, hoping beyond hope that you can sort of fiddle around with the treaty and a new little provision here, or maybe a few extra MEPs here, or a few commissioners there, or a bit more qualified majority there, or a bit more veto there. I don't think this is susceptible to a sort of technocratic fix. If it had been, it would have been fixed a long time ago. We've had I don't know how many intergovernmental conferences and treaties and all the rest of it. I think at the end of the day, like so much in political life, it's about political leadership, about political will, and about political honesty with you know, politicians' own domestic constituencies about how they arrive at decisions in the European Union. That is the fundamental ingredient which is presently missing.
Who's next? Who may I give the floor? Yes, gentleman here, front left.
I haven't said much about the British debate, and nor have you asked me much about it, so do for those of you who are ambivalent about whether you'll ask a question, I'm very happy to answer questions on that.
Okay, thank you. Arjen van den Burg, I'm a spatial planner. One of the problems which may underlay public discontent about the EU may be the lack of European audience. You have separate European audiences in every state communicating in a dozen or more languages. Wouldn't it be wise to start building up some European audience, or, well, maybe not a nation, but an audience for policies? And maybe they should start simply by accepting English as the most efficient language to communicate. We have nothing like that. We only have national audiences. We even don't look at German television anymore. So please start somewhere. Could you give your opinion on that?
So this is actually linked to the earlier question. I basically don't think it is possible to create a sort of pan-European demos. And in fact, one of the reasons I decided not to pursue a political career in Europe, but go into domestic politics instead, was because I think the aspirations of the sort of movement of European federalism in the 1970s and 1980s in particular, well, actually right through to the high point of Delors' European Commission, right into the early 1990s, was based on a fiction. And that fiction is that somehow you can force people from very different traditions and histories and political cultures to occupy a similar political space. I just don't believe that is possible. In fact, the evidence is that far from globalization creating a sort of homogenized, somewhat sort of pasteurized electoral mush in which we all become disembodied digital citizens. I mean, I'm overstating the case for effect, but you know, it was very fashionable. Do you remember? I used to read sort of learned pamphlets 20 years ago about the global government was going to be the next great political innovation. As everything became globalized, Europe was boring enough. We now had to have a global parliament, a global... Actually, what's happened, and this is the interesting thing, no one predicted this 15, 20 years ago, was that the insecurities of globalization, the sense that globalization has unleashed forces over which people, and certainly their representatives, have no control, have oddly, but yet also logically, made people, I think, more attached to the politics they really feel they can understand and control. I've experienced this over the last decade as a constituency member of Parliament for a small part of southwest Sheffield, wonderful industrial city in the north of England. If you haven't visited, please visit. It's a most beautiful city. I've even noticed in the last 10 years as serving that community that people have become more rather than less insistent on having their voice heard on local things which they can control. The traffic in their street, the standards in their local school, the cleanliness of the local park. And in many ways, if you step back on it, you can understand that is quite a logical response to this sort of footloose, fancy-free, globalized world, where all these decisions are taken in impenetrable council of ministers, World Trade Organizations, you know, financiers push a button in Tokyo and it has a huge effect on investment on the other side of the planet. People can't control any of that. They don't understand very much of it. So the political reaction is, right, in that case, I'm at least going to be politically demanding for the kind of politics I do understand. And so you've got this actually quite dangerous trend now of this great bifurcation in politics, where decision-making is becoming increasingly supranational, European and global, yet politics is becoming more and more local. And my view is the only way to bridge that, as I said earlier, is to have politicians who are accountable to local communities, in national parliaments, in regional parliaments and assemblies, in local councils and communities, to be much, much more open and candid and honest about how they interact with supranational governance, rather than hoping. It was a hope that I think many people shared 10, 15, 20 years ago, rather than hoping that we will all somehow kind of fuse into each other. I don't think there's any evidence at all that that is likely to happen.
Yes. Here on the left as well.
Thank you very much. Joe Ray from Diplomat magazine. Mr. Clegg, thank you for your speech. I wonder if you could share with us your views on David Cameron's renegotiation strategy with the European Union, whether you think his demands are reasonable and achievable, and perhaps if you might expand a bit on whether you think the referendum is likely to be won by the In campaign, or quite how severe the situation is from your perspective.
Well, the stakes are enormously high. I mean, they could barely be higher. One of the reasons, by the way, why I think all, you know, people who forcefully predict, oh, it's definitely going to be this outcome, or definitely going to be this outcome, I think why they're so misguided and why I think it is so much more unpredictable than all of that, it's for perhaps quite a surprising reason. A lot of people don't care. And this is where the Conservative Party is always, it's a ruthless, as I discovered, it's a ruthless election fighting machine, which is invariably very, very good at ducking and weaving and anticipating changing public moods, except on Europe. The Conservative Party has always confused its own fixation and obsessions with Europe with wider public... Actually, there's a minority of people who care passionately for Europe. There's a minority of people who care passionately against Europe. Actually, the vast majority of people care much more about the NHS, about education, about crime, about whether their kids are going to get a job, about whether their grandkids are going to be able to buy a home. So you're asking millions and millions of your fellow citizens a question which has huge, almost untold economic and social and political consequences, a question about which many of them don't give a damn. Now, by definition, that is a very, very unpredictable thing to do. But anyway, there you go. The Conservatives, principally actually, because they can't make up their own minds, are now asking the rest of us to make up their minds for them. That's basically why this referendum is being held. It's always the same with referenda in Britain. It's basically when a political party is tearing itself apart. They say, oh, look, hang on, let's stop, let's ask everybody else to decide for us. That's what's going on. Anyway, so there we have it, but it must be one. It must be one. Of course it must be one for all the reasons that I hope I don't need to rehearse to you. David Cameron's renegotiation, I think some of it is of substantive significance. I would, for instance, single out this vexed issue of the rights of the United Kingdom as the largest non-Eurozone economy, the rights of Britain in the single market as the Eurozone integrates further, as it inevitably will have to if the Eurozone is going to become stable and prosperous once again. I think it is a totally legitimate and, from Britain's point of view, important issue that we need to resolve, that we don't, in effect, get a sort of caucus within the Eurozone which can, deliberately or otherwise, discriminate against British economic interests. Do I think you need to sort of threaten to bring the whole thing down to get that sorted? Well, perhaps not. But, you know, nonetheless, it is a perfectly legitimate, I think, interest for the United Kingdom to say, look, hang on, we're worried. And there's, I mean, I won't go into the details, but you're probably aware of some of them. There have been some instances of decisions taken in the Eurozone related to currency transactions, to the operation of financial markets and banking, which have been perhaps accidentally, but pretty discriminatory against the United Kingdom. So that's, I think, that goes under the category of an important substantive. I think some of the other items, frankly, are much more symbolic, are much more about trying to sort of, address the neuralgia within the Conservative Party itself. And I think it's a mixture of that sort of objective and subjective need that is creating the menu that the Prime Minister has come up with. And once that renegotiation is complete, as I'm sure it will be, I'm sure there will be a solution. And I think the help of the Dutch government to the current British government in securing a successful renegotiation is enormously important and much, much appreciated in Whitehall. I think then, I think it's then very important that David Cameron and the government get their head out of the weeds and the undergrowth of the actual technical intricacies of the renegotiation, which most people won't follow at all, and instead make the bigger case about why, in my view, and I hope and believe in the government's view as well, in the long run, the British governments of the future will not be able to provide the safety, the environmental sustainability, and the prosperity to British citizens without being a full and committed member of the European Union. So I think once the renegotiation's over, I hope then we can return to the big argument, which actually is not really affected that much one way or another by the specific sort of technical content of the renegotiation itself.
We have a couple of minutes left, so I'll take a collection of questions. I've had one in the middle of the right aisle. Yes. Then I'll take one here up front, and I saw, yeah, and one there in the back.
Thank you, Mr. Clegg. My name is Peter Noordhoek. I'm an advisor. I'm of two minds on Brexit. On the one hand, of course, it would be a an economic disaster and also in other respects. From a Dutch perspective, we would miss our big British brother when it comes to policy. But on the other hand, I share your assessment of Frontex and what should happen in North Africa. And my worry is that with Britain in the European Union as it is with its policies, it's the British that might be a stumbling block in doing what is necessary for Europe. So what would happen after a positive vote on Brexit? Would this also mean that we could increase the speed of measures in that respect? Thank you.
I have a question here up front.
André Knolneres, Scientific Council for Government Policy. If we would look for, let's say, a middle route between going back to the nations, the nation-state model at the one hand, at the other hand, the federative model. You say we will be a confederation. Then maybe also looking for differentiated memberships. You mentioned the example of the Eurozone. You can be member of that or you cannot be member of that. So if there are differentiations there, what would you think that are the real generally shared basic European values that should define membership in any model?
Mm-hmm. And then a last question in the back of the right aisle. Yeah, there's someone coming with the microphone.
My name is Dian Sparnasio, I'm a consultant. In the 70s there was a phrase in the newspaper that said, don't give them an inch or they will take your English mile. So a no could be feasible. What are the consequences for the UK as a nation if the no is going to be the right answer?
So I've been asked what happens after a yes answer and what happens after a no answer. So let me start with those. Though Peter, your question was quite specific, which was if Britain decides to vote to stay in the European Union, which of course I hope and personally on balance expect it will, what will be the consequences for some of the ambitious collective projects which I've talked about this evening? Well, I mean, we just have to win the argument. You know, the British Conservative Party's reluctance to participate in, yet alone try and take a lead in judicial and police cooperation, has always struck me as being, I mean, irrational is a polite word for it. In government, I fought, when I was in Deputy Prime Minister, I stopped the Eurosceptic wing of the Conservative government from pushing for Britain to leave the European arrest warrant. The European arrest warrant was the instrument which allowed the extradition of Hussein Osman, one of the terrorist bombers in the 7/7 attacks in London, to be extradited in a very short period of time from Rome to London. And they wanted to scrap that. They wanted to scrap that. It is totally irrational to me that in the name of some nebulous concept of sovereignty, Eurosceptic opinion in Britain wants to make British citizens less safe and more susceptible to criminality. You just have to win that argument. And my personal instinct has always been to be more aggressive about it. These people want to make people less safe. That's what their prejudice leads to in concrete terms. And it's a shame because, as leading British figures who work in Europol, the excellent work and international reputation of the British intelligence agencies, which I saw for myself over half a decade working with them, suggests to me that Britain's got real expertise in all of this, which could help set the right standards, the right kind of ways of cooperation and mutual data sharing and so on, and mutual sharing of intelligence, which would do us all so much benefit. So I don't think there's any surrogate, I don't think there's any shortcut, but for making the argument and making it loud and making it forcefully, particularly in the wake of terrible, terrible atrocities such as what we've seen in Paris, where, of course, I don't want to prejudge what will no doubt be analysed in time, but my superficial reading so far is that clearly, these people were not unknown to the intelligence agency. They were not, as they're called in that phrase, clean skins. Some of these people were very, very well known to them, were on the radar screen of law enforcement agencies, and yet still they were able to coordinate this barbaric and sophisticated attack. That begs big questions about whether there was enough cooperation between French and Belgian intelligence agencies, yet alone others. We should be in the middle of all of that, to make sure that we do everything we can, not to create a risk-free world, because we can't create a risk-free world, or at least you can't create a risk-free world in an open democracy, but at least to minimize those risks as much as possible. So I think there's no shortcut but to make the argument. If we vote no, I think the first consequence will be, in my view, that we will not only, the United Kingdom that is, will not only lose one union, its place within the European Union, but we will also lose our very own union of the United Kingdom. Because as night follows day, if there is a vote to leave the European Union, the Scottish nationalists will, and they've said they will, there's no secret about this, they said they'll do this. They will trigger another referendum, and they will say to the Scottish people, you see, told you so, we can't share a family of nations with these Eurosceptic English. Scotland is a more European nation than the rest of the United Kingdom. We need to leave in order to maintain our membership of the European. So it won't just change the European. The United Kingdom will disappear. And then what? Then my kids will grow up in a country. What is left of the rump of the United Kingdom, a sort of angry, isolated, inward-looking England floating somewhere friendlessly in the mid-Atlantic. Well, it's not a great future. The other consequence will be, in terms of global diplomacy and international politics, we will just sink to a much less relevant nation in world affairs. And this was made very clear to me, by the way, over and over and over again in private conversations with very, very senior politicians in the United States, who would say, well, what's going on? We want you guys we want the Anglo-American special relationship anchored through Britain's membership of the European Union. We're not particularly relevant to Washington, let alone to Beijing, Tokyo, Mumbai, if we can't stand tall in our own European backyard. If you can't lead in your own backyard, why should anyone take our leadership on the global stage seriously? So I think we would lose our own nation. I think we'd lose relevance in the world. I think it would be economically spectacularly self-harming. We're a very, very open economy. And one of the great things that unites the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, is that we are maritime, trading, open economies. Always have been. It runs deep in our blood, in my case, from two directions. That in this modern world, you've got to be open to investment, you've got to be open to innovation and change from the outside. That will be significantly harmed. Of course it will. If you're Britain now produces more cars than it ever has done since the early 1970s. We're now, I think we're, if not in volume terms, one of the biggest car manufacturers in Europe. Extraordinary change, but most of that has come, just taking that sector, most of that has come about by huge investment from Japanese and other car manufacturers in state-of-the-art factories in northeast England and elsewhere. Why? Because I think it's a great place to manufacture the cars, to export them in the rest of Europe. Does anyone seriously think that if the United Kingdom were to leave the European Union, that French manufacturers were going to say, oh, well, don't worry, we'll still let all those British car manufacturers have exactly the same privileges and exactly the same access to our European customers? Of course they won't. Of course they won't. And no one should expect that they should. So that investment will dry up. Those jobs will be jeopardized. So I think the consequences could be very great indeed. And for that reason, amongst so many others, I hope and believe that in the end, a good pragmatic spirit will prevail when the referendum is held, even from the many, many people who don't like the European Union or find it irritating or don't like this directive or that directive or think it's run poorly, I believe in the end, most British people will accept that the risk of leaving the European Union, for all the reasons that I described, is a risk which would be far, far, far too great to take.
Okay, with this clear statement, I think we've come to the end of the debate. Together with the Deputy Chair of the Council for Public Administration, Hanneke Meuring, I would like to thank you for your speech, which has been very inspiring, and I think that several aspects of it will also resonate quite clearly here in the Netherlands. For example, the call for political leadership is one that struck me as relevant to the Dutch debate as well. We've a little something for you, which is both very Dutch and very British. So we hope that we can thank you in this way. Thank you so much for attending this presentation. There's a reception here next door in the church, so you can stay to debate Europe and also to admire the wonderful surroundings that we find ourselves in today. Thank you.